Jetzt. Aufzeichnung. Ja.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. I think we're going to get started. There'll be a number of people, I think, that are still coming in according to the registrations. A very warm welcome to our Mind and Life Europe Association members and our Mind and Life Europe friends. We greatly appreciate that you're joining us this afternoon for our special webinar. My name is Cornelius Pietzner, and I serve as Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe. Most of you know that we recently launched the Mind and Life Europe Friends for those requesting a forum to connect more consistently with Mind and Life Europe. And so we're particularly pleased that you've chosen to become a Mind and Life Europe friend and are joining us this evening. And we look forward also to welcoming many more individuals who will become Mind and Life Europe friends in the near future. We have a number of interesting webinars and also webcasts that are planned exclusively for the Mind and Life Europe friends in the coming weeks and months. That will include preeminent scientists, researchers, and also contemplatives closely connected with Mind and Life Europe. So in regard to the format for this evening's webinar, our featured speaker will present to you for about 30 minutes. And after that, we will proceed directly to your questions and responses. And we'll conclude the webinar after 1 hour at 18 hours at 6 p.m. Central European time. A couple of practical points that might be useful for the webinar is that you can use the chat function on your screen. If you move your cursor lower left, I believe, and you can type questions that you would like to pose to our presenter at any time, either during the presentation or directly afterwards during the Q&A time. And I will do my best to sort those questions out and ask them to our presenter. We'll also be listing periodically throughout the presentation an email address where you can ask questions, general questions about Mind and Life Europe or about the Mind and Life Friends, or questions that to the webinar where we may not have time to answer them, and we can respond then to you afterwards, after the program is over. In regard to future webinars and webcasts, we warmly invite you to visit our Mind and Life Europe website and go to the Mind and Life Friends tab where all of our upcoming events are listed, and where you can get a sense of what we have planned for you. For this evening, the topic of our webinar is the mindful brain. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elena Antonova as our presenter. Dr. Antonova is a senior lecturer in psychology at Brunel University London. And prior to that, she was a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College, also in London, where she still remains a visiting researcher. Elena lectures on the neuroscience and clinical applications of mindfulness, and her research focuses on the effects of long-term mindfulness practice using neuroimaging and psychophysiology methods with the application to the prevention and management of psychopathologies. Dr. Antonova was elected a Mind and Life Research Fellow for her contribution to contemplative science in 2017. And I would warmly like to invite her now to take over the screen and share with you her presentation on the mindful brain. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cornelius, for the introduction. Lovely to be with you all. So I'm going to share my screen now for the presentation. So can you all see my screen? Yes, okay. So I'm going to briefly outline the journey of mindfulness from east to west, touch on stages of mindfulness expertise, and then talk about neural dynamics of mindfulness. And in this section, given the time frame for our meeting, I will give representative findings and principles, because as you can imagine, the field has progressed enormously in recent years, so it's very difficult to embrace the unembraceable in 30 minutes. So mindfulness is a translation of the Pali word sati, or samti in Sanskrit, and in colloquial use this word simply means memory or recollection. In the meditation context, it refers to the faculty of the mind applied to keep guard of one's mind. And in that sense, the concept of sati is akin to our cognitive psychology concept of working memory, to keep in memory what is our task, what it is that we're doing in meditation practice. And in that sense, in the family of Buddhist meditations, mindfulness can be applied to any type of practice, to any practice style, or any daily activity at hand. And as we can see here in Pali English Dictionary, mindfulness is only one translation of the term sati, of the word sati. And as you can see, memory recognition as an ability, innate ability we have, enters first, but there are also references to certain quality of the mind, quality of the awareness, intentness, wakefulness, alertness, and mindfulness being just one of the terms offered. So this term mindfulness then really entered this kind of Western secular setting, first in terms of applications, and then in terms of research, scientific research, very much with this person, I'm sure you're all familiar, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who has formulated and provided first evidence-based for mindfulness-based stress reduction. And one of the most common definitions we would find in the Western secular setting is this paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And there's also a more expanded definition, also by Jon Kabat-Zinn, the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And although this difference is subtle, it's crucial, because in Buddhist context, for this awareness and its qualities, there are many different terms that are used. But in secular mindfulness, in a secular setting, the word mindfulness captures the quality of this awareness as well. When we apply our natural ability for attention through a certain process, i.e. on purpose in the present moment and not judgmentally, then we have this, in inverted commas, result, this awareness that arises with its certain qualities. So to sum up, the concept of mindfulness in secular context, both for this kind of scientific purposes of investigation and how it is applied in clinical setting, it is broader than the notion of sati. And one of the crucial elements of this mindfulness as a process, the way I like to think about it, is this idea of experiential rotation. I don't know, how do I disable this thing so you can see my screen fully? Yeah, so mindfulness and experiential rotation. So it's in this sense, what really defines mindfulness is being in certain rotation to our experience, where it doesn't matter what is presenting itself, body sensation, feeling, thought. It's how we experience that really matters, i.e. non-judgmentally, non-reactively, without conceptual elaboration, without being caught up with it, in it, or without avoiding it in some kind of a explicit behavioral sense, or in more sort of inner, implicit mind sense. So then, in terms of stages of mindfulness expertise, the very common structure that we find in many Buddhist traditions is the practice that unfolds by beginning mindfulness of the body. So it could be mindfulness of the breath or body sensations as a whole. And then we progress to working with mindfulness of the feeling, where we start to touch on kind of the subject our subject, our sort of person, the meditator. Mindfulness of the thoughts comes in, where we stop treating thoughts as distractions, which we might do at the first stage of practice, and then we continue to expand our awareness to embrace the whole of phenomena, whether it's sounds, visual sights, whatever senses present to us, whatever mind presents to us, everything is treated in the same non-preferential, non-elaborative, non-judgmental way. And there's four foundational mindfulness, the core structure of MBSR and MBCT. And Anton Lutz and colleagues put this kind of nice diagram, nice heuristic for us to research the sort of the stages of expertise. And it's not...
Enjoy this. It's called the mindful brain. I'm not going to start video because I don't.
Sorry. So the stages of mindfulness expertise then could be thought of as mindfulness of objects, and then moving to mindfulness of the subject, and then starting to rest in what Anton Lutz and colleagues here refer to as reflexive awareness, meaning awareness that neither fixates on the objects of our perception and it doesn't identify with the subject of the experience, whether we're experiencing something that appears to us externally or we experience some internal content such as thought or feeling. So this kind of reflexive awareness has this non-dual quality to it, and non-dual here refers to this loosening of this usual subject-object fulcrum that structures our cognitive and perceptual experiences. We also see this kind of progression in terms of mindfulness being effortful to begin with for a novice, and then we move into more effortless mindfulness, and then there's this notion of king mindfulness, so when it becomes very stable, and then supreme mindfulness when it's completely unwavering and we're just resting in that space of this mindful awareness, unperturbed by whatever arises in the field of awareness. And we can find the stages in the Royal Seal of Mahamudra. And one point I would like to make here is that in terms of mindfulness as taught within particularly mindfulness-based stress reduction, and by extension mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, because it's a very close derivative of mindfulness-based stress reduction, is the fact that the way the practice is presented and the very effortless approach that is taken in MBSR and MBCT very much echoes the approach to practice as found in Dzogchen and Mahamudra, which are approaches in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And those are the approaches that I study most closely in my research. So there's an interesting sort of discussion in Contemporary Buddhism Journal, I can send the references, where John Donne draws this parallel between this very effort de-emphasizing approaches, just resting in the mind as it is, but without getting engaged and caught up in the experiences. And John Donne says that in his understanding of both Mahamudra and Dzogchen, but also what he tasted of mindfulness-based stress reduction, those two traditions are very similar in approach to practice. So although this sort of open presence quality is not implicitly taught, it's very much intended in the context of MBSR. And therefore, in my research, working with long-term Dzogchen and Mahamudra practitioners, what I learn, what we learn in our work is applicable to how mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy approach sort of reduction of suffering in people who have some kind of diagnosed pathology of some sort. And therefore, when we look at the neural dynamics of a mindful brain, we, by extension, look
I might
at
decide it's not interesting.
what happens with mindfulness-based stress reduction but also what happens in experienced meditators, particularly from traditions such as Dzogchen, but also Zen, which is also close. Sort of Soto Zen has very similar approach to practice, which emphasizes non-doing, doing, or effortless effort. So now I need to introduce you to large-scale brain networks in order to make sense of what happens with mindfulness. But before I do that, just give you a brief idea of what typical fMRI experiment might look like. It's important to note that fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is a relative measure of brain activity, a relative measure of neural activity. And therefore, when we look at what happens during experimental condition, we also need to have some kind of a control condition or control baseline. And in many experiments, so-called rest condition is used as a control. And a participant might be put in a scanner and given very simple tasks to do. For example, respond only when you see the arrows pointing to the right. And during the rest condition, they will just have a fixation in the middle of the screen, and they just asked, and now allow your mind to rest. And of course, as you can imagine, all sorts of things might be popping into people's head during those 15 seconds resting state. And sometimes we look at much longer periods of resting state using fMRI. And this kind of spontaneous mind wandering that occurs has a network that supports it, that is associated with it, with this mind wandering state, the spontaneous generation of thoughts, which tend to be, by the way, me and my related. They have sort of I would like to have this and that for dinner, for example. And we broadly call this activity self-referential. And so the network that is associated with the self-referential activity on these slides here is in green and blue. So this is looking at the midsection of the brain. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. We're looking at the left of the brain here on the outer surface. This is looking from the bird's view, from top orientation. And this is again the front of the brain. This is the back. And as you noticed, this default mode network, this green and blue network, is located in the middle line of the brain, middle section of the brain. And the frontal part of it is very much associated with what we might call our psychological self-experience, the experience of this kind of separate self that has this independent, continuous existence. And this bottom part is very much associated with this kind of how we see ourselves, our own idea of personal self. Whereas the upper part seems to be associated with how we think others think of us. What is our social self representation? And we also engage this part when we project into the minds of others, when we extrapolate from our own experience what other people might be experiencing, feeling, thinking. And this posterior part, the part at the back of the brain, is more involved with what Antonio Damasio called kind of proto-self, a self that is based on the body, based on the kind of emotional milieu that is also intermingled with the sort of body sensations and memories, etc., etc., and also position of the body in space. So we can say that this area of the brain kind of builds this psychological self on top of this sort of more basic bodily based self. Because we have this experience of ourselves being separate from our environment by the virtue of being in the body, some kind of a physical boundary. And so what's interesting then, when we look at what this network is associated with, and we know from a number of different studies, there's kind of a lot of studies put together that looked at either remembering the past or thinking about the future, prospection, or theory of mind, thinking about other people's minds. And this default mode network with its frontal and posterior parts, as you can see, pops up in all these conditions which here Buckner and Carroll called self-projection. So we have this default mode network that is associated with self-referencing, this me thinking, me, mine, I type of thinking. And it's also kind of this self-projection from the present moment experience to time travel to the past or the future or to other minds. So as you can imagine, this default mode network was our kind of prime suspect to be reduced in its activity when we started probing the brain dynamics in terms of what happens when we switch from this kind of more narrative self-referential processing to a more mindful one. And the study by Norman Farb and colleagues became a kind of classic in the field. They were the first ones to show that in this experiment, they have people undergoing 8 weeks of MBSR, and they were scanned before and after. And this is comparing this group that was scanned before and after 8 weeks of MBSR during two conditions. One was called narrative by the experimenters, and another one was called experiential, but it's essentially mindfulness condition. And in both conditions, the participants were presented with adjectives, which are personality characteristics. And they were asked to, in a narrative condition, just allow yourself to react to the word, to identify with it. You know, the words could be relaxed, stressed, generous, stingy. There were 50 of different personality adjectives. And in the experiential or mindful condition, the instruction was just be mindfully aware of whatever body sensations, feelings, thoughts come up in association with those adjectives. And what they found is that during this kind of narrative self-referential condition, the prime suspect, the default mode network, was more active with its bottom part, which is called ventromedial prefrontal cortex at the bottom of medial prefrontal cortex, so this personal self, and also the dorsomedial part came up, which is presumably people were also evaluating, do other people that I know see me as the person described by this personality adjective. And we have the posterior cingulate as a part of default mode network also present during the narrative condition. But when we then switch into mindfulness, so participants here switch to mindfulness, the activity of this network went down, but what was more active is the area called insula, which is, we know from other experiments, is related to sense of embodiment. It's sort of an area that maps our kind of visceral sensory information, this sort of interoceptive awareness. So in terms of our practice, in terms of phenomenology of mindfulness practice, is very much related to the sense of being embodied, being present in our body. But also interestingly, there was quite a bit of activity in the parts of the brain that we know associated with working memory. So we see the kind of effortful mindfulness of the beginner here. So this kind of sati as a working memory is signaled here by this activation in the prefrontal cortex. And there's also parts of the posterior lobe on the lateral side of the brain that kind of associated with kind of being more extended in space, so to speak. So this is from my work on Dzogchen practitioners. So this is, I'm presenting a case study of a very experienced practitioner who, as validated by his teacher, a sort of Tibetan Buddhist Rinpoche, who instructs this practitioner in Dzogchen practice, that this practitioner can rest at this sort of stage 3 of the practice, where we define stage 3 a bit earlier on, as a kind of more non-dual way, where the subject and object kind of fulcrum in our experience starts to dissolve. And we're no longer fixating on the object of experience or identifying with the subject. And this practitioner in one condition was asked us to allow the mind to wander. And so we're looking at the brain, kind of brain sliced from front of the head to the back of the head. This is the front, this is the back, and this is the kind of characteristics outline of the default mode network. This is the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate. Also visual cortex was very active, and this person has reported that he's very, his mind wandering is very visual, kind of, it's more like daydreams. So even though the eyes are closed, the visual cortex is very active. So this kind of virtual reality we generate is very palpable and reflects on our primary sensory cortices, so visual cortex here. And then when he asked to rest in this kind of open presence or non-dual mindfulness, the stage 3 of the practice, the only areas that were persistently activated, so it doesn't mean that the rest of the brain wasn't, but just what was persistently activated, the areas of the brain that we know associated with just being open to the senses. So this is a thalamus on both sides of the brain, and thalamus is a kind of as a sensory gate into the cortex. So it funnels all the information from the senses, whether it's the eyes, the ears, the skin, sort of the outer tactile, to the cortex. So the sensory gate is wide open. And also bilateral insula, which is the area, as I mentioned earlier, associated with the sense of embodiment, very much being in tune with the visceral sensations, the heart, the gut. So quite literally, this is a sort of a signature of being in open presence, open to all the senses, outside, inside, all the sensations, all the phenomena. And in this case, in the case of this practitioner, there was almost no activity of this prefrontal areas that would signal to us this kind of effortful mindfulness of the beginner, where this kind of working memory monitoring component is present. So there was just purely resting, undistracted, in the open presence, very much plugged in into the now. But there are a few, so this default mode network hyperactivity or overconnectivity is found in many common mental disorders, including schizophrenia, depression, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. We also see changes in this network in autism. So we're kind of thinking that this transdiagnostic efficacy of mindfulness-based interventions is underlined by the enhanced ability to downregulate the default mode network, because all of these common mental disorders are characterized by hyper self-referencing. It just takes many different forms, like in schizophrenia, it could be hyper self-referencing in terms of paranoid ideations. In depression, it could be ruminative thinking. In OCD, it's kind of magical thinking. You have to perform this ritual, otherwise, you know, I can put my family in danger. So all of these kind of self-referential type activities seem to be associated with the hyperactivity of default mode network. And then using mindfulness-based interventions, using mindfulness practice to reduce self-referential activity, to down-regulate the default mode network activity seems to be one of the key aspects of how mindfulness practice works in terms of promoting kind of mental health and well-being. But important disclaimer here is that the default mode network is not a bad guy. So we're not kind of banishing its activity completely out of our brain dynamic, because the default mode network activity is and connectivity with particular area called medial temporal lobe, which supports our autobiographical memories, is very important for our sense of identity and our sense of functional kind of personal ego, not necessarily something that we fixate upon and treat as a separate existing self, as Buddhism would teach us, but as a functional process that we need to engage in a context relevant manner. So now when I'm giving this presentation, my access to biographical memories is absolutely essential for me to be able to fulfill this function. And when the connectivity of default mode network with each other, with the nodes between the network, and particularly with the, with the medial temporal lobe, when it starts to deteriorate, then we can have Alzheimer's disease. So I'm kind of putting it here. So reducing the default mode network activity, or sort of its dictatorial regime in the brain's dynamic, as well as rewiring it from the tyranny of self-criticism and worry towards serving self-worth and world peace. So this could be seen as kind of what really we're doing when it comes to the default mode network and mindfulness practice. And like sort of paraphrasing this cartoon, "Oh master, is it proper for a monk to use the default mode network?" Sure, as long as there is no attachment. So the default mode network is not our enemy, but it tends to dominate the dynamic of the brain unless we train our minds through mindfulness. And then the activity that it generates actually associated with kind of creativity. So spontaneous thoughts that can arise, they're also information to our mind about ourselves and our present situation. And some thoughts about the future can also be useful. So we kind of have to think about it in balance. I just want to give, if I have a couple of minutes, just demonstrate a few other points about how the dynamic of the brain change when we engage in the experience of mindfulness, in this kind of rotation towards our experience. And some of the kind of influential notions about how we think of practices of mindfulness come from Suzuki Roshi's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And it's very much sort of a taste and flavor of the practice that John Kabat-Zinn, in his mindfulness-based stress reduction, through his instructions, through his work with patients, individuals that he originally worked. Very much this kind of every moment is a new experience. Having this beginner's mind, even to the experiences that are mundane, that are repetitive, that are not new to us in any way, and kind of we can think of this eating of the raisin exercise at the beginning of mindfulness-based stress reduction is this invitation to adopt a beginner's mind and having no expectations and doing a kind of habitual patterns of the brain and the mind and being present in all activities. So I probed this idea of beginner's mind with my colleagues and collaborators by studying habituation. And this is an excerpt from Zen and the Brain by James Austin. Meditative approach called mindfulness or opening up meditation would be just the reverse of habituation, for it implies staying so receptive that each stimulus seems new, fresh, and important. And we can capture habituation by using startle reflex. So normally when there is a loud sound in our environment, we would have the spontaneous jumping up reflex. But if there's more than one of these sounds, we very rapidly habituate, and normally in non-meditators by fourth or fifth kind of loud stimuli, loud banging noise, there's hardly any response in the body. So there's a bit of a busy slide, so it's not so important, but just to emphasize that we had 24 mindfulness practitioners, and the difference between two subgroups was the intensity of practice. And we measured startle habituation by quantifying the eye blink response to loud noises. And the most essential bit here, 2 bits, so I'm drawing your attention to them, is the overall habituation over the course of the experiment. So in practitioners with intensive practice, there was hardly any habituation. So more negative value here means more habituation. And interestingly, in more moderate practitioners, there was more habituation. And there was kind of moderate habituation as we normally would expect it in non-meditators. And this attenuated habituation was very much related to the intensity of practice. So people who practice more often maybe more than once a day and for longer, have done a number of meditation retreats. Their natural automatic, this kind of automatic wide filtering of sensory information. So the brain automatically filters when it's presented with the stimuli that are repetitive and the kind of, there is no new learning, no new information that is embedded in the stimuli. So even if you ask people to pay attention to this repetitive stimuli, the brain automatically filters. But in meditators with this kind of more hours of practice and more intensive practice regime, this very hardwired automatic process is loosened up to a certain extent. So there is this attention to each new moment, even if it's not a pleasant experience, you know, such as being startled, each one treated with the same new, fresh presence. But what is it good for, this kind of more meditation, less habituation? Well, Buddhist psychology posits to us that one of the reasons for the discontent and dis-ease that even people with no psychiatric diagnosis often experience is our rapid habituation to sensory stimulation, leading us to design new and high-intensity experiences. We know that in healthy meditation-naive adults, faster habituation is associated with impulsivity, behavioral disinhibition, and sensation seeking. But mindfulness practice allows us fresh and kind of alert attention to each incoming stimulus, no matter its valence or familiarity. And this leads to experiential novelty, even if the most mundane. And this quality, and we kind of know it anecdotally from our own practice, but also from the reports of contemplatives, this kind of novelty, freshness of the experience is another element that feeds into our sense of contentment and well-being when we engage in mindfulness practice. So I would probably stop here because we are already at 22:06. Cornelius, should I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, maybe. Thank you. If you stop
Okay.
sharing your screen, then we can see you in full screen, so to speak. Thank you so much. You really packed in a lot there in these 30 minutes. Thank you so much. I know I have a number of questions myself, but I'd like to read a question. Actually, there are two questions that have come in. One may have been partially answered, but I'd like to read it anyway, coming from the University of Göttingen. And the question is this: in your study about default mode network and mindfulness, did you recruit long-term meditators or participants without meditation practice? And if they were non-practitioners, non-meditators, how do you decide what length of time is required to train the participants? And are there any measures or questionnaires to check whether the participants are, one, practicing meditation during the training, or two, being mindful during the task in the fMRI?
These are all very good questions. Yes, so there are many different difficulties with studying experimental practitioners, because for these reasons. How do we define experienced practitioner? And sometimes quantity doesn't necessarily mean quality. And you know, although we talk about this kind of stages of mindfulness expertise and the sort of mindfulness of the body, feeling, thought, and this kind of dwelling, resting in non-dual mindfulness, all of this can happen in one meditation session for the beginner, or you know, non-dual awareness might never happen to experienced practitioners. So yes, we kind of try to stay very sensitive to these things. And one of the things I do in my research, I recruit experienced Dzogchen and Mahamudra practitioners. One of the reasons my fMRI studies progress very slowly to the point of publication is that I'm very choosy. I'm really interested in kind of virtuosos of the practice. And I also ask for the opinion of the teacher and the recommendation of the teacher. Can this practitioner rest? in the scanner. And if you can imagine, you know, normally we practice sitting up, eyes open. In the scanner, you're lying down. There is a, you know, a sledgehammer next to your head, or it feels like it. You know, it can be claustrophobic environment. So having practitioners who could drop into this more subtle non-dual awareness and sustain it for a period of time in the scanner is a tricky business. And in many cases, I just have to rely on their honest word. But we're also starting to develop objective markers of practice expertise. And the Startle habituation study that I showed you is one of them. So we now use this kind of not habituating rapidly as an objective mark of expertise. There are a couple of others that we have developed in my lab. I didn't have time to go into them, but I'll briefly mention. So I mentioned there's no kind of, shouldn't be expectation or much anticipatory attention when we really rest in the present moment experience. And one of the ways we can study it is a paradigm called eye movements paradigm. So you just track a dot on the screen. Saccades when you have to follow the direction of the dot, and anti-saccades is when the dot moves this way, but your eyes have to go the other way, right? And for non-meditators, a lot of the time, they will follow the dot before they realize, oh, actually my task is not to follow the dot, and then they will move their eyes. But meditators make that error very rarely because they are staying with the instruction. And also when they follow the dot, for a non-meditator, there's like anticipatory saccade that overshoots the dot and then corrects itself, overshoot the dot and then corrects itself, going back to the dot as it's tracking through the screen. Meditators don't make those overshooting errors, they just follow the dot. So that's another task that we know use as an objective measure. I personally don't use that much the 10,000 hours practice criterion. It's a useful one for the lab, but it's not always the good indicator of the quality of the practice. And also there are studies from other fields showing that 10,000 hours as a mark of expertise only counts for about 1/3 of the actual skill. So there's something else that goes on. And yes, and even an experienced meditator can have a bad day. So developing a kind of rapport with your participants, you know, understanding the practice and therefore asking the right questions of the practitioners during the debrief is another important component to ensure that you measured what you think you have measured. And therefore, I practice myself and use my own experiential understanding, however limited it is, to inform my research and how I approach it and how I interpret what I see as well. So.
Great, thank you. Elena, another question. In your opinion, would it be more helpful to Western Tibetan Buddhists if they could simplify the process by discarding certain aspects of Tibetan cultures that the lamas are teaching?
Interesting question. It's probably needs quite a bit of unpacking and quite a bit of, well, I will need to ask whoever asked this question, what is meant here? If we mean this kind of, yes. Because, okay, one of the reasons I don't have an immediate direct answer is that I went through circles in my mind, or like by the spirals in my mind about my approach to this. And my current understanding, again, based on my practice, based on my encounter with Tibetan Buddhism over the years, when, as a Dzogchen practitioner, understanding Dzogchen for me, it changes the other practices. So how I engage with the other practices and what the benefits of those practices are, let's say visualization of the deity, you know, kind of common Vajrayana practices, they are approached differently. If we are already resting in that space without fixation to the objects of experience and identification with the subject of the experience. So they're bringing other components to it, and practices, for example, such as loving kindness, you know, this kind of, and non-referential compassion type practices, you know, as my teacher says, Sonia Rinpoche, you know, compassion is a highway to non-dual awareness. You know, this kind of spontaneous fountain of compassion arises in us when we rest in what Tibetans would call nature of mind, or Dr. and Mahamudra practitioners would call resting in the nature of mind. So I wouldn't say that they are kind of defunct. I would just say that we have to do them from the right space. And to recognize this space, this mindfulness practice is secularly defined, or the practice of Dr. and Mahamudra in my own journey have been the key.
Okay. I wanted to check something with you. In your habituation study, what I understood was that practitioners and long-term meditators were able to look at each reoccurring sound with a fresh perspective. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Take each
yes.
one.
So they, yes.
So whenever I'm in New York City and I'm surrounded by the blaring of taxi horns and sirens of, you know, blue lights, police and ambulances, I'm grateful to be able to block them out and not take them in anew, freshly. And I attribute part of being able to do that to a long-term meditation practice. And I'm just wondering if you could describe a little bit more how we can differentiate between reoccurring startling sounds that we can look at freshly and anew, and those that we can, in a sense, you know, put in a secondary position.
Very good question. And it actually takes me to, as I was, you know, in the interest of time, I didn't elaborate on all the aspects, but if you remember, I noted that meditators with more moderate experience or more moderate regime of practice, they actually habituated more. And one of the reasons is that they showed much greater sensitivity initially to the startles. They startled more. But so, and therefore, as the experiment progressed, they habituated quicker, and the slope just was much more steep for them. But for experienced practitioners, and for those who practice more intensely, the sensitivity wasn't as high. Matthieu Ricard was also startled by Ekman. Is it Paul Ekman?
Mm-hmm.
Paul Ekman. Yes, Paul Ekman. And if you've seen the videos of this, I've got it somewhere in my files. He didn't startle much at all, although there was like a gunshot sound played next to his ear, and you know, other non-meditators, they were like literally jumping into the air with screams. So my explanation for this would be that for an experienced practitioner, when there's really kind of non-reactivity, equanimity has developed, then things will happen, you know, but we're just not as perturbed. We're open, but we're just not as perturbed. Our bodies are not so jumpy. Our kind of inner mechanism is not so easily triggered. Still responsive, still cognizant, still registering, but it's just not with the same sort of rawness. You can have the freshness, but not the rawness.
Very helpful.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. It makes a lot of sense. So I would like to invite others, if you have a question from what you've heard after it's been sinking in a little bit. I think there's something here that I would like to share with you. I would just read it. I haven't read it now beforehand. So you mentioned, Elena, that we would expect working memory components during effortful mindfulness practice, i.e. stage 1. Wouldn't we expect a greater working memory engagement during mind wandering? After all, during mind wandering, memories are not only retrieved, but also replayed.
Mm.
Did you perform contrast analysis in the single case fMRI study that you presented? In other words, open presence versus mind wandering conditions.
Yes, so thank you for this question, Julio. So, okay, mind wandering. So when we mind wander spontaneously, mind is left to its own devices, the phenomenology of it, we're kind of lost in it. We're carried away by thought. And unless we become mindful that we carry away by thought, and then the working memory, this kind of what also we call meta-awareness, kicks in, then we're very vaguely aware that we even caught up in a thought until working memory actually kicks in, or we notice that we caught up in mind wandering. So this noticing would be an aspect of working memory and would be then related to the activity of the associated brain areas. But mind wandering per se, in its kind of subjective quality, doesn't necessarily have this working memory or meta-awareness component. It's something that can come with it momentarily, or something that we practice deliberately through mindfulness practice. So that's my answer. But at the same time, an experienced practitioner, and I've got a slide on that, an experienced practitioner, when there is relatively stable non-dual awareness, the mind wandering can be very elaborate, right? The thoughts can come and go from one to the other, to the next and to the next. But one just watches this mind wandering without being caught up in it. So the experienced practitioner that rests in the nature of mind, it doesn't mean the mind is blank and empty of thoughts. It's just there is no fixation and a sense of being caught up with the thoughts. But as I showed in my slide, for a very experienced practitioner, that doesn't seem to be accompanied with the activation of the working memory areas. So it's just very effortless state, just simply not being attached to the thoughts, being aware of them coming and going, arising and dissolving. So that's my answer to the first part of this question. And the other one was technical. Yes, so what I showed you were the contrast, the mind wandering of the meditator contrasted with the state of open presence. So in the fMRI, you always have to substitute one from the, subtract one from the other. Yes, so what I showed, what they were in contrast to each other. There was also another task involved. I'm not going, it's a sort of low tensional task, but if I look at that task as well as my control condition, and we know that control task deactivates the default mode network. So during mind wandering condition, the default mode network was very much present in this practitioner as compared to during this low tensional task. But it wasn't so, it was much attenuated in the open presence. I hope that answers the question. I hope that's what the second part of the question asked.
I think it was in your first slide, or maybe your second slide, under the definition of sati, if I remember correctly, you had the sentence in regard to mindfulness that it's keeping guard, it's to keep guard of one's mind. I made a little note here. Did I note that down correctly?
Yes, yes.
And the question is, and I'm not sure this is a fair question to a neuroscience scientist, because it's also a philosophical question, but I wonder what your thoughts are in regard to who is it that keeps guard of one's mind? What is it? What instance is it that keeps guard of the mind?
So this is what we're starting to, okay, so sati has different, or sati and the word mindfulness has different meanings in different Buddhist traditions, right? So Sati for Theravada practitioner, or mindfulness of Theravada practitioner, is very different from what I showed for the stages of practice of Mahamudra practitioner, Dzogchen practitioner, right? So then Sati in kind of more Theravada context has this kind of more effortful quality, this kind of vigil that we keep, you know, and it's almost like from that tradition or in Buddhism in general, it doesn't make sense to talk about mindfulness meditation and non-mindfulness meditation. You know, any meditation, any practice requires mindfulness, you know, being aware of what you're doing and staying on the task, staying on the practice. And then what you're keeping guard of depends on what you're doing. You know, are you blocking the senses and practicing to stay in concentrative samadhi? Then you would be mindful of that. But if I, as a Dzogchen practitioner, I'm keeping guard of not identifying with the subject of meditation, right, as sort of shamatha without support or open monitoring, bordering on resting in the nature of mind, then I will be mindful of not identifying with the subject of experience, not identifying with some kind of everful doer of meditation, but just resting. So I would then be mindful of that, of just resting, right? And then if the effortful me doing the meditation comes up, then my mindfulness should alert me to that, and I would see that as yet another experience that arises in my field of awareness, and hopefully that will dissolve back into that field of awareness. Does that answer your question? Did I understand your question?
It's an aspect of the question. I didn't really expect my this question to be fully answered. For me, this is a deep and complex question. And
Sure.
there was a comment in the chat session, which of course, you know, I've been thinking of too, that part of the instance, in a sense, that monitors or that guards the mind is the self. But the question, another question is, what is the relationship of the mind to the self, and how much mind is comprised within the self? These are bigger questions. That,
sure, but you know, but we kind of, okay, you're trying to pull me into a metaphysical discussion. I answered your question from the experiential meditation perspective, right? So
fair enough, absolutely.
Coming back to the experiential meditation perspective, I don't so much like, in terms of what it communicates, this no self idea. For me, it makes much more sense not self, discovering what is not self in meditation. And therefore, if I unfixate, disidentify with this, and that, what is left in my experience, right? And what is left is certain qualities of presence. And different traditions have different names for them. And then staying with the flow of this experience. But if I start giving it a label, if I call it something, I already frozen it, I already fixated it as such, as something. And therefore I already lost it. I'm already lost that ground of resting. And therefore I really like the term groundlessness that Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche have come up in that, or defined in the embodied mind. You know, that groundlessness, not, you know, between some kind of absolute, by giving it some sign, some language, some word, and a sense of nihilism, like there's nothing there. You know, it's just, no, there is this constant stream of experience, you know, infinitely unfolding, with things appearing and manifesting.
Very elegantly answered or responded to, Elena. Thank you so much. And thank you all participants, our Mind and Life Europe friends and Mind and Life Europe Association members, for being with us and enjoying and being stimulated and inspired what Elena Antonova has shared with us this evening. We're grateful for your presence, and grateful in particular to you, Elena, for sharing some of your research. So we promised we would keep this to an hour, although obviously one could go on for a long time. But I know some people have other engagements, and we want to stick to our commitment. So with a very warm thank you to you, Elena, and to our participants in this Mind and Life Europe Friends webinar. I wish you all a good rest of the weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for our audience for very kind and warm words of appreciation that I'm reading in the chat. So thank you all, and keep safe and healthy at this strange time.